In a statement released yesterday, Senator Angus King of Maine said he believes the president is right to seek congressional approval before moving forward with any action in Syria. He called the conflict there incredibly complex. The lawmaker will have his chance to weigh in on whether or not the U.S. does intervene when Congress returns from vacation next week. But before that, he joins us here, Independent Senator Angus King, a member of the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee, live from Brunswick, Maine. Senator, thank you for joining us this morning. Lynn Sweet earlier in the program basically said we can sort of stipulate that everyone in Congress is going to say, great, wonderful, the president decided to come to us, he did the right thing. The real question here right now is, how are you as a member of Congress going to vote on this issue of military force in Syria? Have you decided yet, will you support military action in Syria?
I have not decided that, Steve. There are a number of questions. The first is intelligence. I think the ghost of Iraq is haunting this debate. It certainly haunted the debate in the British Parliament. And the first thing we have to determine, and there are going to be hearings this week in Washington, classified hearings on the intelligence, on the military option. But number one question is, how solid is the intelligence that this, in fact, was a significant use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime? So that's question one. Then the next question is, okay, what's the response? And what are the consequences and results of the response? So I think I'd be surprised if too many members told you right now that they knew how they were going to vote. I like to, have the information before I make those kinds of decisions. This is an important decision, and there's going to be a lot of work between now and then. There's going to be a debate. I think you're going to see an old-fashioned debate on the floor of the United States Senate with the senators in their chairs and a lot of people making some passionate arguments. One thing I think it's very important to clarify, and that is that the president is not asking for authority to generally inject ourselves into the Syrian civil war. This is all about chemical weapons. And the question really before the House, I think, will be, what, if any, response does the civilized world make if it's determined that there was, in fact, a use of chemical weapons? For 90 years, there's been a general world consensus that this was unacceptable. The question is, are we going to let it go, or is there going to be some kind of response? Beyond that is the question about to what extent do we get entangled in Syria. I can tell you the people of Maine, and I spent all day on the road yesterday, absolutely have no appetite for getting involved in another war in the Middle East. But the narrower question is, what's the response to the use of chemical weapons? Yeah, and you were in the region recently, and I think when you came back from that trip, you talked about being open to the idea of some kind of limited, military military strikes, arming some of the rebel groups. But I guess I look at that, and the question, and you started to get into it there, is if there has to be, if you decide that morally speaking, there has to be some sort of answer to the use of chemical weapons, but the answer is a surgical limited strike that leaves Assad in power, doesn't that just raise the possibility that Assad can turn around and say, hey, the United States came after me and I'm still standing, and it only makes him stronger? Oh, listen, absolutely, and that's the second part of the discussion is, what are the consequences? I mean, you can't assume a static situation that we're going to lob a missile in there and nothing happens. I mean, there are all kinds of potential results. As of late yesterday, we had a meeting scheduled for this Wednesday of the Armed Services Committee on, what are the military options and what are the possible responses. Assad could fire a missile into Israel. Iran could get into the game. This is dangerous territory. If you've read The Guns of August, you know how wars can start almost by accident, and we can make these nice distinctions about, well, it's a response to chemical weapons, but all of a sudden there can be escalation, and that's why this is, I tell you, I have spent time over there, and it is the most complex policy question I think I've ever encountered. There are so many factors, and it's so difficult. On the other hand, there is this principle that the world community has adhered to for almost 100 years, that chemical weapons, because of their horrendous nature, their effect on civilians, is just not an acceptable way of going. One of the big deals, I think, in the next week, and I think it was good to have this a little bit of time here, is whether or not the international community and how they line up. We already know Britain has opted out. The real question to me are the Gulf states and the Arab League and what position they take. If they stand aside and say, well, this really isn't something we're too worried about, I think that makes it very difficult to persuade the Congress and the American people that somehow we become the de facto enforcer of a world norm that nobody else is willing to step up and enforce.
And Richard Wolff has a question for you.
Senator King, I just want to actually follow up on that point, because you've described this consensus that the use of chemical weapons is unacceptable. Are you saying then that consensus is dependent on other countries saying it's also unacceptable to them? And where do you draw the line? France is saying it's unacceptable and they would join military action. And if the United States says it's unacceptable and the United States can take action, is that not enough for you?
Well, I think I think we've got to hear more. And as I mentioned, I think the Gulf states and the Arab League have an important role to play here. What I hear on the street, and it's a fair question, is who appointed us policemen of the world? Okay, you've got an international norm, but if we're the only ones that are willing or have the willingness to step up and enforce it, it raises a question of, what is really the belief in that norm in other countries? I'm not saying that's a litmus test for me, but it's certainly one of the factors. I think there's got to be a lot of discussion both in the Congress, but also among the American people. I mean, you talked about the poll that 80% of the people thought it should go to Congress. I'll tell you, I think it's 99% of the people that I'm hearing from do not want us to get involved in Syria. So the president and those who think this is the right step have a lot of educating to do over the next 10 days. By the way, I think the president's kicking this over to Congress was brilliant. Not necessarily politically, but I think constitutionally, but also because Congress has a tendency to stand on the sidelines, wring its hands, and criticize whatever the president does. Now the Congress is going to have to step up and say, okay, we wanted this vote. We're going to face it. We're going to take the vote, and we're going to understand that these votes are going to be on our record. We're going to have to live with it. It's not going to be easy. I'd just soon not have to go on the record on it, but I'm ready to do it, and I think that's our responsibility. That's what the people sent us down here to do.
All right, Maine Senator Angus King joining us from Brunswick, Maine. I think my parents are actually right down the road from you today. Thanks for joining us this morning. We will pick it right up with the panel next and talk more about all these senators and members of